Hi, Aseem. Welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Aseem, we want to talk about your journey from being an engineering student all the way into getting into Microsoft. So I heard a rumor about a very interesting story about your how you got into Microsoft. So why don't you tell me that?
Yeah, I like to say right place, right time, and luck had a huge role to play. I'll give you my story in a nutshell. So I came here to do my master's in the University of Washington in Seattle. And like most other grad students, when you come here, you're instantly poor, right? Because your exchange rate hits you. And I didn't have any assistantship when I came here. And I was geared up to take myself to the first semester, but I came here looking for a grad assistantship or a tuition waiver or something of that sort. So I landed 10 days early. And I went, the very first day I went to my college campus, I was supposed to meet my advisor. And I was a little early. And so I walked into this big ballroom kind of thing where some event was going on. Little did I know that there was a career fair. So I walked into the career fair. I saw a booth that said Microsoft. Back in the day, we used to have a big orange logo, a black logo with an orange background. So I went there and I started talking to this guy from Microsoft, and I told him about what I do and my vocational background learning in India. And he was very by the mini project work I had done in my final year. And then he said, "Well, would you like to apply for a job?" And I'm like, "Wait, but I don't even know if I can work. You show up on a visa that's a student visa, and beyond that, you don't know anything." And so I told him, "Look, I don't know if I'm permitted to." He was very kind, and he said, "Look, so in that case, how about applying for an internship, because we hire a lot of interns." And I said, "I'm not so sure, but sure, why not?" And so he asked me for this thing called as my resume. And I came to the university the very first day. I didn't have credentials, I didn't have access, no ID card, nothing. The school was not open. And at the scheduled time, I went to meet my advisor. His name was Dr. Radha Puvendran, very nice guy. I'm in touch with him even now. Occasionally, we exchange email. And I spent the first 15 minutes introducing myself. And he said, "I'll see you when school starts." And I said, "Dr. Puvendran, can I ask for a favor?" And he said, "What?" I said, "Can I get a printout?" And he said, "What do you want to print?" So I said, "I want to print my resume. There's this thing called Yahoo Briefcase back in the day that I have a resume on. Can I print?" And he said, "What, already looking for a job?" I said, "No, this thing happened. I went to the career fair. And at that time, you had to pay 25 cents to get a printout. And I didn't even have cash because I was not geared up for it." So he was kind enough. He printed me a copy. I went, gave it to the gentleman at Microsoft. And within a week's time, they called me onto campus, the Microsoft campus, for an interview. I got into a cab and I showed up at the recruiting building, and I went and I sat there, and this girl next to me looked at me funnily and said, "Why are you so overdressed?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" So I was wearing a tie and a formal shirt and pants, and everybody was in jeans and t-shirt. And again, so the interview happened. They offered me an internship, and that was the beginning of my Microsoft journey. So literally, I think before my courses started, I had an internship in hand. And while I was figuring all my ID cards, login status, etc., at the same point of time, I was trying to answer this question of, can I even work in the summer? So that's why I call it a very lucky spot to be in.
Yeah, it speaks volumes about talent spotting at Microsoft, I would say, because it's almost, to use a cricketing analogy, I know you're fond of your cricket. It's almost John Wright spotting Jasprit Bumrah at a net and saying, "Hey, you should be with Mumbai Indians," or something like that. So pretty.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Microsoft would say that. I mean, I've been here 17 years, so maybe they'll say something to the extent of, "Yeah, I think we would rely on you to take that single and get off strike. That's what you want you to do."
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So tell me what happened to your journey after that, right? You became an intern, and clearly you've been there for a long time. What sounds like a long time, from Yahoo Briefcase to when Yahoo Briefcase doesn't exist anymore in that fashion. And in some sense, you are doing things around cloud that started from an early promise of those years ago with the cloud. So tell me, can you describe what else has happened to you?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed, like you mentioned, and a lot has not changed to a certain extent. So I interned there as a dev. I worked on the setup team, and the internship lasts through the summer. And as soon as I finished summer, Microsoft has this thing about they interview every intern, and they want you to come back full time.
Right.
And I was one of the lucky ones to have two choices to pick, either the Windows team or the Xbox team. And Xbox was very new, and I was not a gamer. And so I ended up declining that. And people on my team just couldn't believe it. They're like, "What? You didn't take the Xbox offer?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not a gamer." I met some very interesting, deep, fun, and very knowledgeable people back then who've been my mentors, my managers through the years. So they wanted me to come back right away. So they're like, "Look, you should come back next month as full time and join us, because we need to ship this product and we need all hands on deck." And so my boss at the time was like, okay, so can you quit? I'm like, I have 5 subjects to go, or 7, I think at that time. And he's, yeah, but we need you. And I was like, Nathan, man, like I'm this close. I don't even know if I can. You need a certain amount of credits to get a baccalaureate or to get a grad degree to then get your work visa. So I'm like, Nathan, I don't know if you can apply for a work visa if I don't finish it. And he's, in that case, we have no choice. Okay, I'll give you a semester. And so what typically takes 2 semesters, I had to finish in 1 to come back in time to get going. And so there was no concept of a break in between or anything of that sort. And these were also days where visas were very hard to come by. Right. So again, lucked out, joined Microsoft, did the technical dev role, then ran a PM team, then moved over to doing product planning and product management. And one thing that always interested me is going from a function that I was in to a function that almost seemed like a sister function, but I knew very little about. So when you're a software developer, I used to work with a bunch of PMs, and I'm like, wow, that sounds great. Like, you're a program manager. What do you do? And so talking to the PM team, I then took on a PM role as the next step. From PM, then I used to look at these marketing people and like, wow, you guys must have a really cool job. Sounds really good. What is that? So then jumped over to doing marketing, moved over to the office team, incubated the office web services business, change the dynamic on how services are thought of in the world now. And then I took on this detour to go to sales. Again, similar the hypothesis, similar model. I knew very little about it. An old boss went there and he's, hey, you want to do sales? I'm like, sure, sign me up. So did that. And then came to the world of cloud when just around about the time Satya took CEO and there was some reshuffling. And so I've been with cloud ever since. So I think the common thread there has been like taking a role that I know very little about and trying to go learn a net new different skill. So that's kept me afloat and interested and tied to Microsoft because it almost feels like a net new company, different job, different role.
So I want to go into this attitude of yours a little bit deeper. Did you always have this aptitude towards exploring things on the periphery and using that to catapult yourself to a new role, or is that something that uh, you grew into because also the environment that you found yourself?
I think it's more of the latter. Look, I'd be lying if I said that I designed it that way, right? I think when you're in your 20s, like the next interesting thing that comes across, you tend to think of it and you're like, oh, great, I'll do it, I'll learn. I think that learning thing was always with me, where I have that penchant, I would say, for the unknown a little bit. But I certainly can't say that I designed it this way or I always thought about it and I thought deeply. And if I talk to anybody graduating today, they think 10x more than I did when I was that age. And that's just the nature of being exposed to new models, new thinking, a lot of course, the internet has a huge role to play. Mentors have a huge role to play. And I would say that I was lucky to have great mentors and people who could guide me. But at the same point of time, there was that element of I didn't want to do the same thing again. And one part of it was also, if I did spend time in Windows, I was actually going to compete with some other folks who have spent 20 years there on compilers.
Right.
And then I'm picking my career and saying, look, I wanted to be a compiler guy, which was fine. And there's nothing wrong in having a depth approach. But I always preferred breadth over depth. And that has been my thing since the get-go.
Let's take a more concrete way of looking at this. So let's say you made that shift from, say, being an engineer to getting into sales and product management, those kinds of things. And let's say you do that the same in a few years' time to something else. What would you do next? Would you go and talk to people? Would you start reading a bunch of books? What is the components of making that successful shift from, say, what you're doing today to something that you didn't know you could do?
Yeah, I'll share a model that I think I've learned from, of course, people I have deep respect for in the industry. And I think one of my mentors mentioned this to me. So in any job or opportunity you take or evaluate, you look at it from 3 vectors. The first is the people you work with. Right. The second is the skills you have or are required for the job. And the third is the domain or the space that you are going to take the job in. And at any given point of time, ideally, you want to keep 2 of these things constant, right? Either the people and the skill, and you are entering a new domain, or you enter new, or you enter, or you pick up new skills, but your domain and people are constant. And again, this comes down to the risk managing appetite for that jump. When I did the sales role, I followed somebody who was already there. So I had somewhat of the people thing constant, and I knew the business. It was a different skill. When I took the Azure role, it was a little bit of the domain was new, the people were new, And the skill set was also new because now I was going into more of a CEO type of function. But the way I thought about managing that change is the skill set, although in its entirety was new, the things that I had done leading up to that were all required for me to be successful in the job. So I think I could rely on my skill set, yet changing two things. And that's a simplistic model of thinking about any job change, in my opinion. Now, not to say that there aren't other models, but this is what simply resonates in my brain.
The other thing I realized is that you could easily have been this specialist, like you mentioned, the depth versus the breadth conversation. A lot of people these days, because of the nature of change around us, and also nature of opportunities unfolding in front of us, they need to make that shift from being a specialist to a sort of a generalist. What do how do you compare these two? Because we need both kinds of people in an organization. You need some people who like that depth first approach. One is what makes someone a successful generalist, and what is it that a specialist can learn from a generalist? Because some people listening to you today have been doing one thing steadfastly for the last 20 years, but maybe they've hit a ceiling or they want to pursue other things, but they are not comfortable with the idea of that exploratory breadth. Do you also have a recipe for how do you test the waters before you get there? So two things. One is what makes a successful generalist, and how do you test the waters before you make
Yeah. Answer the second one first. How do you manage that risk? Let's just call it risk.
Right.
Or how do you manage that? Or how do you test the waters? I tend to think of decisions as, is it a two-way door or a one-way door? Right. And the simplest way to think of it is, let's assume that you're trying to enter and check out rooms in a castle. Unless you go into the room, you really don't know what's in it. And therein comes the concept of a two-way door, right? Like you open it, you go there, you spend some time, you check out the room, and you come back. There is a way to come back. And I think the good thing about specialists is that they can rely on their core skill to always come back to if it doesn't work out for them. Right. But what I would say is you need to give it a significant amount of time to stay in that room. Maybe give it a year, 18 months, whatever you feel is right, until you feel that, yeah, it's not working out. And I think only you can be the judge of that. Whereas the concept of a one-way door is a little bit more, I would say, riskier, because there are some decisions that are irrevocable at times. And those could be things like changing geographies. Correct. Or completely like going from, let's say, the tech world to healthcare. Some of these are harder to make the return. So just evaluating with an open mindset on, are you making a revocable or an irrevocable decision, is a good way to think about, am I just testing the waters and can I come back? Or am I swimming too far from the shore? As far as what makes a successful generalist, I actually think that the biggest thing I would say there is you have to be able to deal with ambiguity very well. Generalists typically just get problems thrown at them, and you're trying to, what we call at Microsoft, growth hack your way out of it, right? You're going to try something, you're going to fail, you're going to fail again, you're going to fail again, you're going to go one step forward and 5 back, and then you're going to suddenly go 7 steps forward, right? You've got to be able to deal with that ambiguity and manage that anxiety, to be honest, that some people have. If that's something that makes you super anxious and you feel that you're out of control and you're falling in a spiral, maybe that's something that you want to rethink, whether you are meant to be a generalist or not. The other thing that I will say is, and I think a lot of people can probably resonate with the word called jugaad, right? There is you've got to be able to have that jugaad mindset. I think growing up in Bombay, a lot of us have that. And I was lucky enough to bring that to bear. Basically, you got to pick up yourself when you have a setback and you're like, oh shit, okay, now what? I think the now what is more about you got to fall forward rather than fall backwards. So that to me, I think is the biggest skill set or a mindset, I would say, that journalists should have. And I think the only other thing I would say is 9 times out of 10, you have to rely on standing on the shoulders of giants to get that victory and leaning on people who are advisors, who are experts in their field, because journalists don't know it all. And they certainly don't have the, I would say, the depth expertise that a depth expert has, but relying on others to extract the information, to connect the 2 points, to see patterns is the other thing that I would say is probably another important skill.
Aseem, you may have heard of the idea of a board of directors for individuals, right? Have you, over the years, assembled a group of people that play different roles in your life and career?
I think you stole the words out of my mouth. Like that's how exactly I would have described my mentor base. They're my board of directors, right? I get different perspectives. I get support. I get negativity, and which is good, healthy negativity. I get caution. I get pushed. I get questioned. I get conflicting opinions. And I think the one thing that is consistent with the people that I talk to is they never give you the answer, which I think is a core skill to have in a board, right? You want the board to pose questions, and then you're in the driver's seat as the product trying to figure out like which way do you want to go, how would you answer that question. And I don't think any of my mentors has ever said go take this or go do that or go do Y or go do Z or don't do X and don't do Y. I think the biggest question they've posed to me is, okay, great, I understand what you're saying, tell me the why, what, and how. And Aseem, how would you describe it? And so I think that's a core thing that any mentor kind of plays the role of coach. And you'll often hear in the cricketing world, like people talk about, I want a coach who's guiding me. I don't want a coach who's fixing my elbow height, because you try to tell Virender Sehwag to correct his stance, he's going to say, that's not going to work for me. Or you try to tell Rahul Dravid to play a lofted shot, and he's going to say, that's not my strength. I'd rather keep it on the ground.
Yeah, in fact, they are literally they're sounding boards. Their job is to make you listen to yourself from a different angle. That's how I sometimes see it. Same as one grows in their careers, the big difference between being a fresher or an intern is moving from execution to taking these high value decisions. That is what you ultimately get paid for, in a sense. You mentioned a couple of things around decision making. Do you have any other principles or mental models around how you make decisions that have served you well?
I'm generally big on trying to model everything, and often it's not that there's a black and white answer. In fact, my wife will tell you that I'm more gray than any person she's seen in the world. And I think whenever she asks me a question, I think she says, don't say depends, because it doesn't depend. I want an answer. And I'll come back and say, no, I think context matters. It always depends. And so she'll tell you that I'm a very depends kind of person. But I think in my defense, you can at least have some sort of questions that you might want to ask yourself to get all the data out in front and really ask yourself, what is that model? To me, the simplest one has been the 10-10-10 model, where any decision I take or want to take, however ambiguous situations there are, I tend to rely on data as a input. A lot of people rely on data as the sole input. I look at it as one signal. There's many others. But ultimately, it comes down to how do I feel? If I make this decision in favor, let's say, how will I feel in 10 days? How will I feel in 10 months? And how will I feel in 10 years about that decision? And I think if the answer to those three things is a resounding affirmation of that decision, then I think it's an easier one to make. But if I have doubts and I'm like, look, let's say I'm dissatisfied with somebody on my team, and I basically just go and say, hey, that's really bad, like you did it the wrong way, I might feel great because I've given them like very harsh feedback. But in 10 months, I'll be like, yeah, I don't think I should have done that. And in 10 years, I certainly will feel about it differently. I'm like, yeah, it didn't even matter. And so I think if you put that frame of reference, your outcomes start to be a little bit more consistent, and your outcomes start to be a little bit more, I would say, something that you can conform to in the longer run.
Fascinating. I think a lot of us who have trained as engineers, we are not necessarily trained to recognize these emotions, right? Or the volatility of a lot of these emotions and the fact that they even out over time. Again, was this vocabulary of emotions, how important is it for managers, for leaders to recognize that there is this emotional landscape that you're always dealing with when you're working with humans? It's not all cut and dry, and you need to have an emotional model of the world as well.
Yeah. I think some of it has to have a no regrets kind of move, right? Remember a time when we had our first daughter, and I have two, 7 and 3. And one of the entities that I was looking to join wanted me to join right away. And I was like, no, I can't do that. I want at least a month's time off. I want to figure out childcare, etc. And this was a very up and coming entity, and it would have done wonders for me. And I decided, no, I think principally it didn't make sense because it was the first child and I wanted to spend time. I wanted to be here. And I didn't want to miss out on those moments, however small or big it might be. It was a matter of 30 days. And so I decided to pass on the opportunity because philosophically it didn't align with the principles. And it would have changed the course of where I would have been, what could have done, what could have happened. But to me, I think it's still a no regrets move. Like, I don't regret it one day. I would still make the same decision again. And purely because if I put it in the context of fullness of time, like 50 years down the line or 20, 40 years down the line, like I would still have regretted like chasing the opportunity over spending a month where my heart was. And that's what I call as no regrets move, right? That to me is still a no regrets move, even after 7 years or 9 years.
I can't detect any trace of regret in your voice while you're recounting that anecdote. Are you the reflective kind of person wherein you make time for reflection very systematically? You say, I'm going to schedule some time for it, or do you just let it happen? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm the kind of person who'll sit and have a scheduled thinking time or whatever. I'm often guilty of not wanting to do too many things in life in general. I try to keep it simple. Driving times are mostly thinking times. I hope it doesn't come across as deadly where my mind is half asleep on the wheel. Times when I step out to go get my coffee, or my morning routine has to have some amount of coffee. And funny story, I used to live right across from my building at Microsoft, but I never walked because I always drove to get my coffee and come back. But I think those mini breaks are what energize me. I think those are thinking times. I hope I don't complicate things too much in my head, try to keep it simple. But then again, I feel that the more data you add, the more cloudy you get in your judgment. So keeping your principles and your priority list updated, at least in your head, I think has served me decently.
Are there any other principles that you would like to call out as being very important to you?
I do have some that I occasionally revisit. What I would say is I think in general, transparency, high integrity, the usual, and a lot of us share those principles. Those are generally top of mind for me. I try to not run towards things faster, and meaning that I don't want to be in a race. And I think this is something that growing up playing on a sports team teaches you, right? Like you're competing with wanting to be the best version of your own self. You're not competing with the world. You're not competing with somebody on grades or GPS scores or how fast have you been promoted or what are the things that you do. Because I think everyone's journey is different. Correct. And I think the quicker you can recognize as the better at peace you will be. That's one principle that I follow. I'm like, look, I don't want to compare myself to anybody because honestly, there's no comparison. For every vice president that you meet, there is a president. And for every president you meet, there's a CEO and a CTO. And for every CEO and a CTO, you meet a billionaire. Correct. So I think there's no sense of trying to compare apples and oranges because everyone's journey is different.
Since you mentioned things like these important values, once you rise up the corporate ladder, you go into more rarefied kinds of zones, and there is a danger that it's hard to get real feedback, the feedback that is not so pleasant, gray. How have you taught yourself to get that part of the radar going as you've grown?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Is it more along the lines of like, how do you extract information from the feedback, or what do you treat as signal versus noise?
Yes.
Yeah, see, it's a tough one. And I don't think that I've made a very clear, or I've gotten to a very clear understanding of how to do that. I think the key there is to recognize patterns, right? Like if you're seeing consistent patterns on people are hesitant to react with you, or I think I'll give you a simple example, right? As you grow in your career, like when you ask for a meeting with your team, there's a lot of production that goes into it, right? And while it is sometimes necessary to have the level of depth and detail and preparedness, I sometimes feel that I don't want my team to do that, right? I would rather have my team just have an open dialogue and saying, hey, here's the challenges. I don't want you spending time in preparing for it or in rehearsing for it or spending countless hours preparing for an executive. It doesn't make sense. And then I think you've got to be very upfront and say, look, I don't want to create new work. I'd rather have a discussion. And so I think if you're trying to get some of these patterns out and address those head on, that's probably something that you might want to consider. Now, I've also been guilty of not seeing these patterns that quickly. And I think that's something that I constantly am working on, is saying, okay, what is the pattern that I'm seeing? Is there a pattern even?
And in the last 1 year or so, since so much has been in flux, people have also been, you don't run into people in person as much, I'm sure you would have liked to, especially with people who are newer to your organization, who probably not seen you in flesh and blood. What has changed in the last 1.5 years in terms of how you made that effort to keep those channels open, that keep that level of intelligence trickling through to you?
Yeah. Look, I'm on the side of less is more here, purely because I think there's a lot of realization, at least in the working set of folks, that they already have a lot of Zoom meetings, the Teams meetings, online engagements. There's fatigue that's crept in. Correct. People are managing family and work and young kids and older parents and home activities and kids schooling. And it's just a lot more systemic tax on people more than anything else. I try to have these mini touch points, of course, but again, these are like very quick flybys. And mostly these are virtual. They have to be virtual. We're not violating any social distancing norms. But I also rely on my team and my management chain to then go down to their teams and follow the same thing. I want to create a lot more space actually for people to have maybe empty slots where they can get the work done, where they can tend to things at home as well. Because this is the new reality of even at home. Like we struggled with 2 young kids for the first 3 months. Like my wife and me were literally taking turns on who was watching the younger one while the other person was on call. Both of us couldn't be on the call at the same time. So I think this is a reality of most. And I think this recognition of that fact, I try to err on the side of less is more. And it works in some cases, and in some cases it backfires because information is not being shared that easily. So it's a push and a pull, a yin and a yang. I don't think I've gotten a model there as yet, but hopefully I think when people start getting back to work and hybrid work environment becomes real and operational, some of these growing pains will go away.
So, Aseem, I want to move away from the world of management and the office for a brief while and take you to a field, literally a field that you're very passionate about. So, I know you're very fond of cricket. Tell me about your cricketing. Start with telling me what's your preferred role on the cricketing field.
I like to say that I was a star player, but for Kiran building, right? Like most of people in Bombay are like there's somebody in that building who's really good. My journey, like most people, and I'm joking, my journey, like most people, started with playing cricket in the building with my friends and after school every day. And it was just a fun time. I wish I could go back and play a game again with my friends. And that's how it started. And then I moved to Pune for my junior college, and my engineering just continued. I played for the college. I played for the engineering college as well. We played a lot of interstate tournaments somewhere in the middle. Again, gully cricket continued. Then when I moved to Seattle, I was very excited to find the Microsoft cricket team. I played for the Microsoft cricket team until about 2 years back. And then as sort of kids started to get older and they need a little bit more time, and I couldn't justify traveling for work and playing on the weekends, cricket unfortunately took a back seat. But I'm hoping that this year, hopefully I can get to play a little bit more.
So do you still follow international cricket quite closely?
Yeah, whenever I get a chance. Like I was following the Australia series ball by ball. The IPL, not so much. The Australia series timing worked out really well, and it was great to see. And honestly, I always thought, like, what is cricket going to be after Sachin? Who's going to follow it? All these guys like Virat, like even Rishabh Pant, like exciting cricketers, and so much more athletic, like so much more sports person, I would say. And so it's always fun to watch it right now.
Correct. And are you one of those people who constantly is quoting cricket stories and taking lessons from cricket, or are you just compartmentalize the two?
I don't know if I draw a whole lot of parallel, but I think playing a team sport definitely influences you, right? It influences how you think about scenarios, how you think about teams, how you manage teams, how you are a part of a team. And that certainly had an effect on me. I don't think I code it as much. The only time I get to talk about cricket was when I traveled to Australia for customer meetings with a broken foot. And in Australia, of course, everybody knows cricket. And so they asked me what happened, and I said Yorker, and everybody got it, right? In America, you tell them a Yorker, and they're like, I don't even know what that means. I thought cricket is a non-contact sport. Like, what happened to you? Why is your foot broken?
Interesting. And you mentioned Sachin, but is Sachin your number one cricketer, or have there been other people that you really enjoyed watching?
I enjoyed watching Sachin in person, meaning that I've gone and seen a lot of test matches live, like 5 days in Bombay. And I've sat ball by ball. I've seen Vinod Kambli score his double 100 and Sachin scored massive hundreds. And those were definitely my cricketers that I looked up to, or at least admired growing up. But I think in hindsight, now I think my allegiances have changed a little bit towards Rahul Dravid. I think the tenacity, the grit, and frankly, I think even in the retirement stage, like what he's been able to do with the young cricketers, like that's just immense respect. I think it takes a certain amount of individual to say, look, I'm going to go focus on the youth and create the supply as you might for Indian cricket and transform it. Like it takes a whole lot. And I think he's probably my favorite of the lot.
Yeah, I think we briefly spoke about these new crop of cricketers, and it's unlike the talent pipeline that was there earlier. Now, it seems to be a lot more systemic, and there are people like Vid, I think you're contributing a lot to that. I actually wanted to draw a parallel between that and or staying relevant through these other means, right? Advisories, mentoring. I know that you advise a lot of tech startups and you're very keen on the next generation of technology as well. When you wear that hat, what is different? What are you bringing to the table, in your opinion?
So I think I've learned that I've been lucky enough to be a part of three big businesses, right? Windows was always a flagship business for Microsoft. And I came and I learned the business when it was already well established. Like there was 90+% share in market. And so I learned a whole lot on how does a well-established business works. I then worked on the incubation for Office Online, which was basically revamping the entire business model of how Office was sold.
Correct.
And again, Office had huge amount of share, but we drove a mix shift from licensed software to the web services version. So I was lucky enough to see the transformation of that business and lead through some of it. And Azure, I joined when we were a 300 people team growing to thousands. And our P&L went from millions to billions. And that business was just like a startup which has grown 10x and fire under the belly. And so I think I was lucky enough to have been a part of these three big events or three big businesses. And it taught me something as an operator. It taught me about how to grow, how to scale. And in working with the startups, that's one thing that I'd like to bring to bear, which is like help them scale, because that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for talking to me as their product person, build new product or write code or anything of that sort. They're incredibly smart people. But I think when you think about scale and what levers do you pull, like that's, I think, something that I think I could contribute back. And selfishly, I think I can learn something because the next generation of entrepreneurs are like the Rishabh Pants of the world, right? No fear. You're going to go do it because you have immense talent and passion and energy. And it's almost like you can learn something from them, which is entirely different. If I draw the parallel, there's so much sportsman-like capability and athletic ability that these youngsters are bringing to the table. If you draw the parallel in the startup world, I want to learn that from them. Like, how do they approach a problem with a no regrets, no fear mentality, which some of us probably did not. So selfishly, I get to reverse mentor myself, right? I get to learn from these people on how do they think differently, like how would they solve the problem. And then I think you have the push and pull or the yin and yang of let's exchange ideas, and then you narrow down on something that might be a combined effect might be much better than the siloed effect.
Right. And I also know that you're very keen on scaling. So, do you have any principles, mental models around scaling that you often bring to these conversations?
I don't think I could outline one. I think there's many. So it almost applies to scenarios differently. Like any investor or startup founder would tell you, first prove out the concept, make sure that there's value exchanged, make sure that you're creating value for your customers. And then I think it's a matter of putting fuel on fire, but you've got to light that fire first.
Correct. One thing that you must have encountered when you got into the scaling mindset is trying to institutionalize things like practices, cultures, those kinds of things. Any observations on how you've seen that unfold? So let me give you one maybe prompt to think about. When you yourself or when Microsoft was going from this almost old style on-premise legacy kind of software to making that shift to the world of SaaS and subscriptions and so on, what changed in the way you were trying to unlearn certain practices and institutionalize a bunch of new practices?
A lot of it was basically seeing the trend that the world is moving towards and latching onto it. Today, and if I draw a parallel, today people don't want cars. They want to use Uber. Like, why buy a car? Why spend the capex? And a similar mindset sort of applied in the cloud services world, where we're looking at it from the perspective of saying people don't want to manage their IT. They want to be doing what's core for their business, right? A transportation and a logistics company wants to focus on business logic for transportation and logistics. Conversely, a soda manufacturing company wants to get good at manufacturing soda and creating new products. They don't want to worry about their IT infrastructure. And so I think we look at it and say, okay, great, let us do it for you. And so that's the pattern matching and tech keeping up with where the world is going. And you'll see like a lot of these business models for new consumer companies, even they're evolving with the audience set in mind. And it's even different from a geography perspective. India was always heavy on it wasn't e-commerce, but I call it phone commerce, where you would call up the local store and you would give the guy a list and he would send someone home and you got your groceries. The West is just coming to adapt that model, right? Where we're starting to do this on an app or a phone, and there's Instacart who's got an insane valuation is doing that. They've got a shopper that gets dedicated to you, and he or she will pick your list and deliver it home. Conversely, we are getting exposed in India to the mall culture, right? Where you're going inside, you're spending time, you're seeing those things. We've always had that, but we are inspired by the West when it comes to that. And so there's these different business model, right? Like contactless payments is the other one, where people don't want to carry around cash and fat wallets. India, for the most part, has skipped credit cards and got straight to Paytm, and the West is still catching up to that. So to I think cut it short, I think it's a lot to do with what trends are you seeing in people's natural behaviors and how do you fit your product or your culture to match to that.
In fact, this phone commerce, I think, has been the backbone of India's economy for the last year or so, given all that had happened around us. It was fascinating to see that come to play. I'm sure a lot of people have the average, everyone from the average Kirana guy to all the startups like Dunzos to thank for to stay afloat. Do you see this kind of cross-pollination across cultures as a source of strength for people like who grew up in one culture, now you find yourself immersed in another? Are there all strengths that just pull together to be much larger than the sum of the parts?
No, I don't know if that provides a differentiated capability, but I think it definitely provides a different outlook, right? You've grown up in a country that's fast evolving, and you've come to a country that to a certain extent has infrastructure settled. But then you're looking at the best of both worlds and trying to compare patterns, contrast patterns. When ride sharing comes up, I always chuckle because we've had ride sharing for a long time. Like I went to college on my friend's scooty or scooter, and that was just a part of life, right? When Starbucks introduces, they call the turmeric latte, I was like, my grandma used to give it to me when I was 4 years old, and now I'm wanting to pay $4 to $6 for it. That's insane. But I think there's definitely goodness in terms of recognition, understanding, and just, if I use the word, if it's not overused, but empathizing with different cultures and backgrounds and what they bring to the table.
In the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot of Indian origin leaders making it right up to the top. Currently, Microsoft is headed by one of them, and this is no longer a surprise. It's just taken pretty much for granted in many cultures. But is there something different in the kind of makeup of these leaders? Does it just happen to be a coincidence? I've read books on that topic that say that there is something more to this phenomenon. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think to compare and contrast, like every leader has their strengths. And I think Satya or Sundar or pick your favorite Indian leader, they all have their strengths. And conversely, Bill, who was at the helm of Microsoft, had his strengths. And I personally don't know if I am qualified enough to say with conviction that, yeah, I think that there's a definite pattern here or not. But I do think that each of them incredibly humble, incredibly hungry for learning, incredibly smart. I just feel that there's just a different amount of like intellect and horsepower and empathy and recognition of the world. And I think broader thinking. I don't think that it has got to do anything with origin. Maybe there's research that proves otherwise. But from my perspective, I think it's just the individual themselves who's just stellar.
Correct. And I think they also have the advantage of being in a deeply, to use the word meritocratic or performance oriented kind of culture, right? Is that something that you felt very comfortable being part of, or did you have to say, wow, the space of progress, change, what is expected of me is something that I need to get used to?
Honestly, I don't think I thought about it. I think it's a little bit of like when you're sent in the bat at over 7 to 10, you're facing a situation and you're batting accordingly. If the going gets tough, you take a single, you get off strike, and you try to keep your wicket, right? And if it's a flat wicket, and if it's not turning and it's not swinging, then you make hayday. So I think that sort of, and again, I try to draw that parallel from sport because that is actually how business and careers are generally. You excel at different points of time in your career. You slow down at different points of time in your career. And there's nothing wrong or right. And no two batsmen are the same. No two bowlers are the same. And sometimes you nick one and you walk and you come back on to do a next inning. But I think that's how it goes. And I probably have just reacted to the situation more than being proactive. And of course, like everybody has their set of mentors and everybody has guiding principles. And those have in general served me well. but I don't think I planned it as much as I think I like to believe. And in fact, I think the people who are entering the workforce today, the recent graduates, they I think are a lot more planful. They're a lot more deliberate. They're a lot more clearer in what they want to do.
I just want to go into a little bit of how you keep yourself abreast of things, right? What is your approach to learning as an individual? So let me start with the future trends thing because we spoke briefly about it. You have a very deliberate approach to keep to understanding how things are moving forward. How do you keep that future radar going? Is it primarily through reading, or do you subscribe to certain things, or is it participating in a lot of conversations? How do you know what's coming around the corner?
Yeah, thankfully, working in tech kind of exposes you to all of that.
Correct.
All the big tech companies, enterprise companies are my customers. So are new generation startups. And so I think I feel lucky enough to be at a spot where these things are naturally coming. And I'm meeting people, I'm getting exposed to them, I'm talking to my customers, I'm surrounded by great engineers and product people. And so I think naturally I get a lot of it through work. As far as subscribing to something specific, I don't think that there's one. There's multiple. Like I read the Geek Wire in Seattle. There's of course the WSJ. From what gives me energy is really talking to a lot of people who are doing deep thinking. Again, these are colleagues, these are customers. I wouldn't say that there's a particular technical thing that I read. I try to read a lot, although it's gone down quite a bit. But I think future trend wise, looking at mostly behavioral patterns has been interesting to me. How people are behaving, where is money being spent? How do you follow the dollar in an economy? Right. What are tech advances and research that's happening that is going to transform the world? I think 5G is one such thing. Correct. Hardware getting cheaper is another trend. People having one too many devices, another sort of pattern. There's potentially smart edge, as people talk about. That's another one. Distributed computing, of course, as you have to say, there's machine learning, there's robotics, there's so much trending estimates being made. But I think the way I try to rationalize it in my head is what's that one killer scenario that brings all of these things together? And if you can weave that golden thread, then you can see which ones are here to stay and which ones are not. And there's some areas that just seem like there's a lot more studying to be done. If I were to talk about it intelligently, like I think crypto is one of them. Like a lot of people do some deep thinking on crypto, and unfortunately I've fallen behind.
So would that make you very uncomfortable? And would you say, I need to kind of get into a course or kind of start following certain kinds of people? What would you do in such a case? Honestly, I think it's a little bit of, I also know that I can't consume it all. But I have people who work in the fintech sector as friends, colleagues. And I think whenever I get a chance socially, I'd love to pick their brain on, hey, what do you think? Like, and I think when you talk to someone, you actually don't just get the raw data, but you also get a lot more insight and analysis on what are they thinking? What are the questions that are bothering them? And I think that to me is more powerful than any paper that I've read. Is because I'm also having an active dialogue where it's essentially a Q&A session, right? I think that's one of the reasons why you folks might be doing a smart cast, because you're getting unfiltered what's going on and how are you thinking about it versus somebody writing an article and saying, hey, go read this. So I do enjoy the interactivity. And I think if there's one topic that I feel that I need to go read up more or understand more, then I'll go have that conversation. Right. So in a lot of the threads that we spoke about today, I think we've spoken about the role of other people. They could be mentors, they could be startup folks that you're advising. Did creating a network or so-called networking, personal branding, those kinds of things come naturally to you? Or was it just something that you just built along the way, but you're very deliberate about it? Any thoughts on that? I think I'm an extrovert by nature. I think I'm very comfortable hanging out alone, and I'm equally comfortable being in a crowd like full of like 1,000, 2,000 people. And so some of it just comes naturally. You strike up conversation, and I'm always interested in like hearing from people as to what they are doing, what they are thinking, like how's their life different from mine. And again, this gives me a lot of energy, I would say. I'm not one who's quiet. I'm seeking, I'm talking. And so I don't think I ever liked the term networking, to be honest. I never enjoyed the term. It felt very made up to me. And I explain it to people in a way saying, look, if it interests you, do it. And do it because your heart is in it. Don't do it because you want an outcome, right? And I've been lucky enough to maintain relationships that I have from school, from college, and rely on my peers, my
my close friends, people I've worked with 10, 15, 20 years ago, I still keep in touch occasionally. Now, it's not that frequent, but I think we've maintained those relationships, even if it's a simple little hi or hello. And you don't do it because you want something out of it. You do it because you have a connection with the person and you just enjoy hearing from them on perspectives and whatnot.
Correct. Right. That makes sense. I also want to ask you about things like reading. Are you a reader, or do you consume your information from other sources?
Yeah, I think if Sanasi was here, she would say that we would fight over Tinkle comics when we were little. And there is some amount of truth to that. If you ask her, she'll give you an answer on who the culprit was. And if you ask me, I'll tell you who the culprit was. And we have different answers. But I wasn't a voracious reader, I would say, but I do enjoy, reading. I'm somewhere in between. If I get time, I'd love to pick up a book and read. But my reading is limited to mostly biographies or experiential books or memoirs or something to do with business models. Sports forms a huge component of what I read about. But I don't enjoy fiction. I don't enjoy the moonshot kind of things. And the reason I think I enjoy biographies is because 200 pages gives me an insight into someone's like 50, 60-year life. And that to me is like the best ROI I can ever get by reading something. And so I just enjoy biographies because they're light, they're easy reads, there's nuggets of information in there. And that's what I naturally gravitate towards.
Correct. Any favorite biographies that you can think of at the top of your head?
I think my favorite is Andre Agassi's Open.
Yes.
That is definitely right up there on that list. And if I were to pick one book and say which one should people read from a sport perspective, it is that. I would have loved to pick a cricketing one, but I actually think Andre Agassi's one is right up there. And the other one that I really enjoy and I sometimes keep going back to is John Wright's biography called Indian Summers.
Right.
That's the other one that is a lot to do about player versus coach mentality. And there's a lot of parallels to be drawn.
Since we are staying with sports a little bit more, how have you seen teamwork itself change over the years? Because I'm sure when you started, there was a certain kind of culture of teamwork or how managers were seen. And there's been a greater degree of, because of digitization, because of a certain shift in, say, new generations coming in. How has teamwork itself changed over the years?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting pivot. I actually think that definitely it's got a lot more collaborative. There's a lot more access to technology, access to information that has opened up a lot of shared understanding, right? Initially, I think back in the day, there used to be that one engineer that everybody went to and everything was in his or her head, right? Now, I think the information is available everywhere. So I think everybody starts from a common shared understanding. Now, yes, there is experience and experience is still going to have its own value. But a lot of it is starting to democratize, if I use that term. And that has also given people fresh new perspective. People are bolder, they speak up a lot more, and rightly they should. There's nothing wrong in that. In fact, it's like the differences lead to a better product. And that's why I think diversity and inclusion as a concept is huge and it's important and has its own bearing in society. The more perspectives you get, the better you look at something from multiple angles, and that just inherently by itself makes it better. I think outside of that, there's a lot more, I would say, empathy. There's a lot more understanding of different perspectives and why that perspective can be different, right? You're not only designing for 80% of the market, you're trying to go all the way and you're saying, look, I want to design it for everybody. It can't be that I'm designing it for the power user. I'm also designing it for the person who's going to use the product at a bare minimum experience level, and it should work both ways. So I think there's definitely that element on change of how teams have evolved.
All right. So, Aseem, we are coming to the end of our conversation. So, I want to do two final sections before we close. The first section is kind of getting your hot takes on the future relevance of certain areas. So, I'm going to give you a topic. Just tell me what you think is going to be the future relevance of that. And should you want to pass, you can do that. So, let's start with easy one. The future relevance of cricket.
Huge, global, short, but evolving, and I would say high growth. I would like to say high growth.
Okay, from cricket, let's go to another C, the cloud.
I want to use the word enabler because I think it starts to become an enabling ground for a lot of innovation that then starts to happen on top of it. Right? I think there's going to be a point where the value that the is going to offer is going to become assumed value, right? Everybody's going to assume that this just
Mm.
works. And this is the way the new world is going to be built. So incredible amount of potential. And I think we're just scratching the surface today.
All right. Let's ask you the future relevance of a country like India.
Filled with opportunity, I think ripe for explosive growth is what I would say. And I think tremendous amount of talent that's getting exposed to the world in meaningful ways. And frankly, I think just a hotbed of innovation.
Okay, that's good to hear. Let's ask you the future relevance of Silicon Valley.
Mm, I would say steady state to a certain extent, because I think Silicon Valley has proven out a great model that I think everyone's latching on to. And Silicon Valley will always have a special place in people's hearts from a technology standpoint. But I think worldwide, like whether you pick a country like Israel, or whether you pick something like Hyderabad or Bangalore, or you pick places like Austin in the United States, I think they're going to start to give that a run for its money, and not in a bad way, but there's going to be healthy competition and people wanting to replicate that model elsewhere.
Okay. With so much changing, what are the one or two things that you think will remain timeless? So even if we dial forward 10 years, there are certain things that you can take for granted as a business, as an entrepreneur. Anything comes to mind?
I think tenacity and grit is definitely something that will be timeless, right? Like people are going to push boundaries. And that's actually for the better of everybody. I don't think that you can replace tech, and tech will always evolve. But I don't think you can replace that wanting to break barriers, wanting to push envelopes, not taking no for an answer. I think those things from a humanity standpoint and what humans will do with tech is going to be timeless.
Okay. So you're fundamentally an optimist about technology and humans.
Yeah, I think technology is a tool. Technology is a platform, right? But at the end of the day, you want to be able to innovate with that for the betterment of humankind. And I think as long as that goal is unwavering in an entrepreneur's mind, you're just going to make better use of tools, and you're going to keep making better tools.
Okay. So with that, Aseem, let's go to our last section. A few quick takes on your personal habits and productivity practices. So the first thing that you do when your work day begins is?
Can't function without coffee.
Okay. How do you structure your calendar? Is it full of blocks, pre-planned, or is there a lot of flexibility to it?
Every week is different. I think it's a combination of meetings and work time. And as much as I like to, I try to build in at least a mini break within the day. It's just something that, even if it's like a 10-minute break, that I can step out, and especially in this new world where you can go out, like just breathe a little bit, come back, maybe get another cup of coffee, drive to a small closed location, take a 15-minute break. I think that just helps me.
Okay. One thing you insist in your meetings to make them very successful?
Less production value, more authenticity, more conversations, more brainstorming, not completely finished product all the time. I think this is the whole philosophy of let's iterate versus wait for something perfect.
Okay. One habit that you picked up in the last 1.5 years, it could be because of the environment around you or just something that naturally happened to you?
In the last year, you would say? I think I wouldn't necessarily say it's a habit, but I was never a go for a walk kind of guy. But I think the lack of gym time or play time or sport time has forced me to take walks occasionally. It's also probably because I'm getting old, but I think I try to do that as much as I can. I try to socially distant walk with my friends, colleagues, if I can, and so I think that's one that I wouldn't say it's a habit, but I think it's an occasional habit.
Okay. One thing that you try to keep in mind when you consume news, or which could be PR, which could be fake. One thing that you do when you consume news.
I try to sift through what is data versus what is opinion. I think in the world of today, it's important to understand what is the actual data versus when somebody is overlaying an opinion, which is trying to sway you one way or the other. And so I try to get to the bottom of, okay, what is the actual thing that is being reported here versus people trying to sway me one way or the other.
Okay. One thing, this is the final question, one thing that you want to add to your repertoire in the next decade?
I think spotting growth areas, empowering entrepreneurs and having at least worked with a couple of them who've been able to transition an entire industry or deliver huge value for changing the way people use technology or people interact with product. I think that's something that I would like to go at. I don't know when, what, how, but it's just an aspiration to say, great, you've done all of these things. You've been an operator. Like, how do you now take something and I think I've been lucky enough to do that with cloud, right? Because when I started with the Azure team, like I said, we were small, but our P&L is like the billions, but maybe one more shot at doing something like that.
Okay. So Aseem, we started this conversation talking about your lucky break as an intern, and we've come full circle to talking about luck. But I think you've made your luck more than anything else. So thank you so much for being part of this CTQ Smartcast. It was lovely talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's exciting, and I definitely enjoyed all the rapid fires as well. It was a first.
All right. Thank you so much, Aseem.